Well, how much money is enough? I wonder if you've been thinking about that since the beginning of the service today. I typed that into the Google search on my computer, and this was the list of things that I got. How much money is enough? And then it just gave me this whole list of things. How much money is enough to retire? You know, I'd like to know the answer to that question. How much money is enough to live on? How much money is enough to be happy? How much money is enough money? How much money is enough to live off of? How much is enough to move out? Maybe some parents want to know the answer to that for their kids. How much money is enough to live comfortably in the U.S. of A? How much money is enough for a single person to live on? That, and I'm sure there are a million more that could be added on there. Would you do me a favor this morning, whether you're online or here in the room, would you just talk to somebody near you right now? Just pick one of those statements out and come up with an answer to how much money is enough. How much money is enough? Go ahead, do that. I'll give you a minute to do that right now. If you're joining us online, type something in and give us an answer there too. This would be a great question to ask a bunch of kids, you know? How much money is enough, you know? They might tell you like $20 or something, you know? Probably when I was a kid, I probably would have told you $1, you know? That's inflation. There you go. But anyway, how about some answers out there? What were some of the things that you came up with? Don't be bashful. Just tell us. Go ahead. What? Okay, you make what you have be enough. Okay, that's good. That's good. How much is enough? Whatever your needs are, not your wants. Kids need more than they think to move out. Oh, yeah, that's so true. That's so true, Ron. Yeah. All right. Anybody else? Oh, when the last check bounces, you know that okay. All right. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think that it's one of those questions that sort of changes depending upon your age and your stage in life. You really reflect on those things in much different ways depending upon where you're at. But the reality is that money takes up an awful lot of space in our lives, whether we are conscious of it or not. Money has a power over so much of our life that Jesus actually spent more time talking about money than he did about any other single subject, and that should in and of itself be an indicator to all of us of its place in our lives and more importantly, the power that it has in our lives. And because of the place that we give to money in our lives, it's easy to understand why Jesus had so much to say about money. And we're going to look first at Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. And I'm going to read from the New Living Translation, where Jesus says these words, "No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other." Go ahead, I want you to read this last sentence with me. "You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." Let's read that one more time. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. Now, I chose the New Living Translation here because I like the image that this word gives us here in the last sentence. You cannot serve God and be what? to be enslaved, to be shackled, to be tied down, to be imprisoned by money. Now, ultimately, what we believe is that Jesus came to set us free from being possessed by the power of money. And the Proverbs, as we're going to look at them today, provide us the wisdom that we need to discern when we are being possessed by the power of money or whether we are living to serve God with the wealth that we are provided. So, we're going to start by looking at two things from the book of Proverbs that talks to us about the damaging power that money has over us. And then we're going to come back and pick up on one positive thing that the proverb has to say. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is greed. Greed, okay? I don't know if you noticed, maybe over the last couple of years now, that when you go to the grocery store, or maybe like me, if I'm ordering from Chipotle on my app on my phone, it asks me if I want to round up, And, the first few times I was at the grocery store and got asked that question, I'm like, I just spent $100, and now you're asking me for 42 cents? I mean, did y'all have to, think about that for a moment? I just gave you $100, and now you want another 42 cents. If you stop and think about it, if you have to have that conversation with yourself about what you would do with that extra 42 cents to round up to an even number, my guess is that we have an unhealthy attachment to our money. Look at Proverbs chapter 28, verse 22. From the New Living Translation, it says this. It says, greedy people. By the way, do we have any greedy people here this morning? Okay, good. I like the honesty of this group. There's a few of you that raised your hand, okay? I'm going to challenge you all today to recognize that I think in some way we are all greedy, okay? In some ways, I think we're all greedy. This is what it says. Greedy people try to get rich quick, but don't realize they're headed for poverty. Greedy people try to get rich quick, but don't realize they're headed for poverty. Now, when you read through the Proverbs, when you listen to the words of Jesus, when you read the prophets that write so powerfully about greed in the Old Testament, we see over and over again that this is true, that greed leads to poverty. Greed leads to poverty. The power of greed in our lives is probably why it's listed as one of the 7 deadly sins. Because what does greed do? Greed leads us into more and more areas that not only steal our life, but end up destroying the lives of others. I mean, think about this for a moment. You probably know somebody, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more in a moment, but you probably know somebody whose life has been destroyed or at least harmed in some way by greed. Now, if you ask a greedy person how much is enough, they're going to tell you, well, it's just a little bit more than what I have right now. And greed, I think, comes from many different places, but I think there's 2 places in particular we need to be aware of greed coming from in our lives. And the first one is a scarcity mentality. A scarcity mentality. It's the idea that I'll never have enough. I'll never have enough. And so therefore we're greedy. We always want to be sure we have enough. And I think there are a lot of people that live with this scarcity mentality. The other place where greed comes from is fear. Greed comes from fear. Fear that arises from financial struggles, maybe when you were little or at different different points in your life, or when you listen to the news and it just paints this picture of doom about how the world is going to just implode. We suddenly are overwhelmed with fear, and when we have fear overwhelming us, well, those fears lead us to be greedy. Now, greed is really just very simply, it's an unhealthy attachment that proves that money has a grip on your life. Notice, not that you have a grip on your money, but that your money has a grip on you. Greed is believing that if you have just a little bit more, then that's all you'll need. But the fallacy of that is that every time you think you got what you need, you want just a little bit more. And the problem with greed in our lives is that it has consequences. It has consequences. I want you to look at these three scriptures from the Proverbs, and look at the words that are used here. They're highlighted in the red, but the first one, it says here it is again, a greedy and grasping person destroys community. Such is the fate of all who are greedy for money. It robs them of life. And the greedy stir up conflict. Now, if you ever wanted a commentary on our culture, it's right there in those three Proverbs. If you stop and think about it, okay, we have such a problem with greed in our world that it destroys community. It robs people of life, and it stirs up conflict. Now, you may recognize this. You may recognize this in relationships, okay? We could probably recount lots of stories about how greed has destroyed families and relationships. All you got to do is have somebody in the family pass away. And you'll discover very quickly how greed has the ability to destroy relationships and families. Greed, I think, shortens our life. And greed is always stirring up conflict. I mean, all you got to do is look at the news. Elon Musk wanted to pay some exorbitant amount of money to buy Twitter. Now they're going to go to court and spend just as much money fighting over it, right? It's greed, and it stirs up conflict. Now, what is the antidote? What is it that will cure greed in our lives? 2 words: contentment and trust. Contentment and trust. We read about this not only in Jesus' words, but also throughout the New Testament. Paul talks a lot about learning to be content. But in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus admonishes us not to worry, but to trust him. And remember that trust is the opposite of fear. Trust is the opposite of fear. Trusting is knowing that God will provide for our needs. So we need to live in an attitude of trust, but we also need to have this contentment. And I love the way Rich Villodas put this. He said, contentment is living free from the lie that having more of something makes something more of you. Now, if you haven't circled that, highlighted it, made an asterisk beside it so that you go back and read it later on, grab your sermon outline, do that now, and take this home and think about it. Contentment is living free from the lie that having more of something makes something more of me. Well, if I have more power, then that will make something more of me. If I have more fame, that will make something more of me. If I have more money, that will make something more of me. But all it does is look at the consequences. Okay? It brings destruction, and it brings all sorts of negative consequences into our lives. Contentment is living free of that idea. So, first word from Proverbs today is greed. The second one is debt. Debt. Look at Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7. Again, if you read the Proverbs, just look for the image that is being portrayed in the proverb, okay? It's so evident here. The poor are always ruled over by the rich. So don't borrow and put yourself, what's the word here? Don't put yourself under their power. Don't put yourself under their power. Now, what happens is when we find ourselves in debt, we become enslaved. We become enslaved. A good way to think about this is that whenever we go into debt, it changes the locus of control in our lives. Okay, so long as we are not indebted to something or to someone, we have control. But when we find ourselves in debt, suddenly we are under control of someone else. And I think it's important, we don't want to lose control in our life, but that's what happens when we find ourselves in debt. We find ourselves enslaved. We find ourselves shackled. We find ourselves tied down. Now, debt makes us slaves, and I heard somebody say this the other day, and this was so good. Debt makes us slaves who drive around in nice cars and live in fancy houses, but we're still slaves. Now, if you let that sink in for a few moments and just hop in your car today and start driving down the road, you'll see what I mean, okay? Debt makes us slaves who drive around in nice cars and live in fancy houses, but the reality is we're still slaves. As I said earlier, Jesus came to free us from being possessed by the power of money, and that includes the power of debt. Now, we just live in a world where debt has been around for 1,000 years, and it is going to still be around 1,000 more. But you know what? We are ashamed of debt. We are ashamed of debt. I mean, when was the last time you walked up to somebody, introduced yourself, and then said, "So how much credit card debt do you have?" You know, we don't talk about debt because what? We're ashamed if we're in debt. Now, I just want to clarify something here this morning. I'm not going to get into that whole thing about should you go into debt to buy a house and all those kind of things. I'm not here to talk about that today. But I want you to think about the image that we're talking about when we're talking about debt. We are talking about living under the control of something else. Now, what are we going to do if we're going to change our reckoning with debt? Well, we're going to come up with two words here today. And the first word is reframe, and the second word is refrain. Okay? Say those two words with me. Reframe and refrain. All right? What we first of all have to do is to reframe our understanding of debt. Okay? Now, if we think of debt as just something that, it's out there. It's not something that I have to worry about, okay? When it's out there, it's not on our mind. It's not something that we are worried about. But what does debt do? As we've talked about it here just briefly, debt makes us a slave to someone else. And if we reframe the discussion of debt as placing ourselves in a subservient relationship to another person, it changes our understanding and our perception of debt. And therefore, when we recognize that Jesus came to set us free from the power of money, it helps us to reframe our understanding of debt. Now, not only do we need to reframe our understanding of debt, we need to refrain from going into debt, okay? That simply means that we have to re-examine our decision-making so that we will refrain ourselves from going into debt needlessly. Now, one of the most important things to recognize about indebtedness is that it is very easy to get into. It is very hard to get out of. Okay? Maybe if you think back, if you went to college, maybe you had the experience where when you walked into that college campus, that there were all sorts of credit card people there who wanted to give you a credit card. And you're like, somebody's offering me free money. And you start to use that credit card, and as you're using that credit card, you're racking up this big old debt. And then suddenly you realize, oh, they weren't offering me free money. I have to pay it back. And so what we need to recognize in our lives is that we have to practice self-control. By the way, did you know that self-control is one of the words that we find in the list of the fruit of the Spirit? We're all good with love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. But when we get to that last one, I think we've forgotten, and we only count 8 of them. But the last aspect of the fruit of the Spirit is self-control. And that's what refraining is all about. It's recognizing that we need to be in control rather than to be controlled. And so we need to learn to refrain from choices that are going to lead us into debt. And we need to learn to practice self-control as much as we are able to practice love and joy and peace and all those things. So there's a negative side to money, that is greed. There is the negative side, which is debt. But then there is a positive side, which comes out of the words of Proverbs. And that is found in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 25, where it says, "A generous person will prosper." Who wants to prosper here? You want to prosper? Y'all want to prosper? If you want to prosper, what do you need to be? Generous, that's right. A generous person will prosper. Now, I'm not a prosperity gospel preacher, trust me, okay? I do not believe that, but I do believe that it's true that a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed, the proverb says, okay? Whereas greed has a negative effect on an individual, whereas indebtedness can have a negative effect on us and sometimes others as well, generosity always has a positive effect, not only on the one who receives, but more importantly, on the one who gives. Now think about this for a moment. When you have little children, you teach your children early on to be generous, okay? You teach your children to do what? To share your toys, right? Okay? Children are also very generous with germs, right? Okay? But that's a whole nother topic. But we are generous. We are trying to tell our children, be generous, share your toys with somebody else. And then when they do, we're like, yay, you've shared. So what happens from the time we're little until we start to grow up and we stop thinking about sharing our toys and we become much more possessive of what we have and we say, it's mine. I worked for it. It's mine. And if somebody else wants to have what I have, well, then they can do what I did. See, generosity, remember we said this earlier from that tweet, generosity has to start in here. I can encourage you to practice generosity, but generosity has to really come from deep down in here. And generosity is really learning to live, living with open hands. It's recognizing that we need to hold on to things rather loosely because ultimately it doesn't belong to us. Ultimately, it's not going to be yours. Someday, I'm sorry to tell you this, someday you're going to die and it's not going to belong to you anymore. Just read the book of Ecclesiastes in the 3rd or 4th chapter. You'll find exactly what I'm talking about there. We don't own any of this. We're going to pass it on to somebody else. So hold on to it lightly. You know, the proverb teaches us that the way we really honor our money or honor God with our money is to share it with others. Because what is generosity? Generosity is basically genuinely caring and concern, being concerned for the needs of others. Proverbs 22:9 says this, the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Over and over and over again, when you read through Scripture, what we see is a generous God, a gracious, generous God. And as His children, we need to express that same kind of generosity in our lives. So how do you become generous? Well, you start with giving what you can. Start with giving where you're at right now. A lot of times people are asking me questions about giving to the church. Well, I truly believe that you should give generously to the church. Okay, I've talked before about proportional kind of giving. Oftentimes in the church we talk about the tithe or giving a tenth of what you have back to God through the local church. Some of you, if you had to start today to give 10%, you would find yourself severely stretched. But maybe what you need to do is you need to start thinking in terms of proportional giving, where you choose to give a portion of what you have back to God through the local church, and you begin to take steps towards a place where you are giving back to God a tenth. Is a tenth the ceiling of our giving? No. A tenth isn't a ceiling. A tenth is just a guideline. We can actually be more generous than that. And I think that we need to recognize that out of our generosity, we will be blessed. Now, let me just be clear that you don't be generous because you want to get more, nor do we somehow manipulate God when we practice generosity. But what we do is we recognize that because of God's generosity to us, we are empowered to be generous to others. Let me bring this in for a landing this morning. How much money is enough? Well, I don't think you're going to come up with an answer to that question. But I think there's a lot of wisdom that can be learned from the Proverbs and from Jesus. And we have to be aware of the power of greed in our lives. We have to be aware of the subtle ways. None of us are greedy out here. I am sure of it, that you are not a greedy person. But greed has little ways of sneaking in, and we need to be aware of it. We also need to be aware of the enslaving power of debt in our lives. We need to recognize money isn't a neutral thing. Money has a way of pulling on our lives, and it pulls on our lives every day. And to be free of the power of money, we need to make choices that help us to be good stewards. And in answering the question of how much money is enough, we always have to recognize the opportunity to be generous people, to be generous with what we have now. Okay, generosity isn't a characteristic that is dependent upon having X number of dollars in the bank. Okay, generosity begins with what you have today, and it grows as you see the blessings of your generosity. But ultimately, the question of how much is enough comes down to whether or not money has taken the place of a rival god in your life. Has money taken the place of a rival god in your life? We're going to go back one more time to that passage from Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one, despise the other. Say it with me. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. Now, Jesus gives all of us the knowledge that we need to make wise choices. Question is, are you going to be enslaved by money? Are you going to let money become a rival god in your life, or are you going to become wise? And think about this. How will your life be different if you choose to honor Jesus in the way you handle money? You will either be a wise person who generously gives from what God has provided you, or you will be a fool who finds heartache and pain at the end of the rainbow.